World Infant and Adolescent Mental Health Day, the Indian Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health, which is a member association of the International Association, also participates in this activity every year. The theme for this year's World Infant, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Day is Bridging World's Mental Health Support for Displaced Children and Families. A brief word on the whole context and experience of displacement. Human displacement occurs in many contexts. It happens due to migration. It happens due to development when you build dams and large areas of land are flooded and people are displaced. It occurs because of natural disasters. It occurs because of man-made disasters, particularly where armed conflict is concerned. So displacement as an experience comes with its own attendant micro-experiences, which include the experience of trauma. What we're going to be sharing with you today is titled Reimaging Mental Health Interventions for Children in Armed Conflict through the lens and through the prism of loss, reconciliation, and justice. I take this occasion, friends, particularly to welcome our friends and collaborators from the state of Manipur. What Sheila is going to be speaking about today is based on an issue that has been, the state of Manipur has been contending with for several years now. Very briefly to introduce Sheila Ramaswamy. Sheila has a master's in social work and a second master's in public health from the London School of Tropical Medicine. After working for many years internationally in complex humanitarian emergencies all over the world, particularly in areas of armed conflict, she has been working initially with the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service Project, which later transformed into SAMVAD, which is a national initiative and integrated resource on child protection and mental health and psychosocial care, initiated by the Ministry of Women and Child Development and located in the Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at NIMHANS. We've been operational for 5 years now, working in 4 verticals: mental health, care and protection, education, and policy and law. Sheila also has a PhD on her work on the child and law, looking both at children in conflict with law and children in need of care and protection. So the whole frame of reference of trauma, loss, grief, displacement indeed has been something that Samvad has been preoccupied with. We ourselves spent several days in Manipur when the sectarian violence kind of broke out. This is the context of what we're going to be speaking about today. With these words of introduction, it is my honor, privilege, and delight to introduce my colleague and my friend, Sheila Ramaswamy, to present Reimaging Mental Health Interventions for Children in Armed Conflict through the prism of loss, reconciliation, and justice. Sheila.
Thank you, Dr. Shekhar. Welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see many familiar names on the screen. Especially warm welcome to our friends from Manipur and the Department of Social Welfare. We're so delighted that you made time for us, and we hope that you will share your thoughts, particularly in addition to others, at the end of this talk. So let's jump right in. Reimagining mental health interventions for children in armed conflict. We're going to be looking at this in the Manipur context. I will briefly take you through the Manipur experience in as detailed a manner as possible. We'll begin with the context. I will share with you some of the work that we did with the children by way of interventions, and then propose a model for mental health interventions moving ahead. So that's broadly the framework for this evening's talk and discussion. So as several of you are aware, Manipur actually witnessed the start of violence, again, not new to the state, but anew in 2023 in May, following a contentious order by the Honorable High Court in regard to some of the major ethnic communities. I'm sure you've read about this ad nauseum in the news, in the newspapers. You know that the two communities refer to the Meiteis and the Kuki communities primarily. Anyway, there were demonstrations, there were protests because of the High Court decision, and this rapidly escalated into ethnic clashes, and then followed several months of breakdown of communal harmony, violation of human rights, widespread property destruction, displacement of people. There were, by the end of 2023, over 300 relief camps in Manipur across the state, with people living in suboptimal conditions, despite, of course, the best efforts of the state government, with lack of access to basic amenities such as shelter, healthcare, education, as to be expected when there is prolonged and mass displacement of populations. And then this combined with the uncertainties surrounding people's return home, the lack of basic services, family separation, social isolation, and above all, the continuing violence, which led to the worsening of mental health of people at large, right? Children, as always, are some of the most vulnerable subgroups in situations such as these. They were disproportionately impacted with issues like displacement from homes to the relief camps, separation from families, of course, loss of family members, friends, disruptions to school and education. There were PTSD symptoms observed, and some rather worrying things with children deciding to join some of the armed groups and actually participate in the violence, because considering as how they were sort of immersed in this culture of violence and in a situation literally of choicelessness, for this situation was certainly not of their making. SAMVAD was then approached by the Department of Social Welfare, and SAMVAD also offered to work with the department, the Manipur government, to extend assistance to the children, particularly through training and capacity building, but also direct assistance. And so our team spent not a very long time, about 8 to 9 days in the state with the following objectives. So we looked at responding to protection, psychosocial, and mental health needs of the affected children. That is, first, by working with children directly in the relief camps and providing training and capacity building to the district child protection functionaries, subsequently also to the district mental health program staff through the Department of Health. And we also used our time in the relief camps to demonstrate how to do activities and interventions with children in the camps to all the people that we had trained, to the stakeholders and service providers that we had trained. Another objective was to bring in or to liaise with the specialized tertiary care mental health services, so that a subgroup that would for sure need depth psychiatric interventions, including medication, therapy, etc., could access it. So we worked particularly with RIMS, the Regional Institute at Imphal, to look at how to provide this, as well as, of course, the DMHP. Because in situations such as this, typically about 5 to 6% of a subgroup of children and adolescents would have more severe forms of anxiety, PTSD, and so on, requiring psychiatric interventions, right? So here's what we did with the children in the camps, and I'm going to describe to you, I hope you will find this interesting, what we did with the children. Beginning with art activities, very simply, we provided colors, papers, and said, draw anything you wish. The children were a little hesitant at first, and then they came in droves from here, there, and everywhere. It was a bit like Pied Piper, really. Showing also the need for engagement. And all the pictures you see up there were what children drew. No prizes for guessing that what they drew again and again, and what everyone drew were houses, mountains, trees, gardens. Manipur is a beautiful state, as I'm sure the Manipuris on the session will agree. It's a hilly state, and that's why you see mountains. And children told us that what they really missed was looking out of their windows, coming out of their homes to see the mountains from which they were so far away in these relief camps, right? How did we use these pictures? We got them to draw these pictures, but we went around talking to children to elicit narratives on their emotions, on their experiences in regard to leaving home, right? So questions such as, whose house is this? Where is it? Who lived there? Tell me more about what you remember. Tell me about what life was like at home. And this also served as an entry point to discussing how different life was here. Now, these pictures also provided a scaffolding for us to validate or acknowledge children's emotions about, the whole experience of displacement. So here are some examples of scripts we used. Oh, what a beautiful house you have. Seems like you had a lot of fun playing with your friends in the garden, eating fruit. I understand how hard it must be to be so far away, how much you must miss it, how hard it must be to be in a place that is uh, so new, to have to live with people you don't know, to go to a school, because by then children had also slowly started going back to school by the time we visited, and told us that it was hard to make new friends, that they missed their old friends at home, their classmates, their pets, right? So all the sense of loss, their fears about a new place. So a lot of acknowledgement of these kind of emotions that children had erstwhile not had any opportunity per se to express. Um, how we finally capped this activity was also to then suggest to them that they could keep these pictures, and many children took them to stick near their sleeping spaces, or said they would carry these pictures around with them. And we said, whenever you miss home and you feel sad, you can take out this picture, take a look at it, remember some of these happy times that you had and that you've been telling us about, or to draw more pictures to recreate the experience of being back home. So those were some of the ways in which we used the art activity, amongst others. We also did some very interesting exercises using story building methods. Being a largely mental health group, of course, you're familiar with how this is done, to seat children in a circle, begin a story, and have every child contribute and continue to add to the story. But what we did here at the end, and I'm going to show you an example of how we did this, was to get children to consider alternative endings to these stories, discuss their preferred endings, and I'll tell you how and why we did this. Here is an example of a story that one group created. I'm going to quickly read it to you so you know what the endings were about and the themes were about. Once upon a time, there was a brother and sister. Their names were Toibi and Tobal. These are well-known mythological characters in Manipur, these names. Toibi and Tobal had a brother. One day, a witch ate him. When Toibi and Tobal found out about this, they were very angry. They decided to kill the witch. So Toibi and Tobal hunted for the witch. Finally, they found her. After a long fight, Toibi murdered her. But they found out the witch they had killed was not the witch who ate their brother, but her twin sister. Toibi and Tobal then set out to find the witch who ate their brother. They found a third witch on the way. The witch was standing across a bridge. When she saw Toibi and Tobal, she got scared and ran away. The bridge was broken, so Toibi and Tobal could not follow the witch. Toibi and Tobal continued to look for the witches. They went out riding with their horses, finally found the witch who ate their brother. A long fight continued with the witch. Toibi and Tobal fought very hard, but alas, they could not kill the witch. She just disappeared and did not come back. Take a moment to consider this story and the themes that are being projected into it. Look at the theme of violence, of killing, of wanting to go after the killers or those who committed the violence, the hunt for them, the need to find them, the need for, the feelings of vengeance, the need for revenge, right? How the witch finally disappeared. So the idea that sometimes we don't even know who these people were who committed these atrocities, who engaged in this kind of violence, and the despair then about what to do, right? Very much reflective of the situation that children were in. So now, one possible ending was, of course, the one that the children gave, that the witch disappeared, never came back. We introduced two other possible endings and discussed them. So possibility two was that the witch who disappeared comes back, the fighting restarts because Toibi and Tobal are still angry with her for killing their brother, right? The other ending that we introduced was Toibi and Tobal's mother says to them, what is the point of fighting? If we keep fighting and hurting each other, this will never end. So why don't we make peace with the witch so that the fighting stops? And so they met the witch and agreed to stop fighting and live in peace. So we had a very interesting discussion with the kids. And while some said they would still go with possibility two, and continue the fight, most children, particularly in the 7 to 12 age group, the middle childhood group, said they would rather have ending three. And when asked why, they said it's because they had lost so much and that they would never want a situation of this nature. So you see, there's just a little glimmer here and, an illustration of how elements of reconciliation and peace can be introduced to children. And I'm going to say more about this moving ahead. All our activities were interspersed with movement and relaxation activities of various sorts, which the children thoroughly enjoyed, particularly the very young children who were 4, 5, 6 years old and who were relatively more non-verbal. And now we come to another interesting intervention that I want to give you a glimpse into. Some of our conversations with adolescents and how we use them. The relief camps had many adolescents. Several of them who came to speak to us were 9th and 10th graders. They were sort of hanging around the relief camp, doing what adolescents do, listening to music, watching stuff on YouTube, helping their siblings with schoolwork, and so on. We used music as an entry point because Manipuri communities have a lot of music, a lot of singers, rappers who sing on particular themes. So our entry point for the conversation I'm going to share with you is about an artist who was singing about the other ethnic community, where these kids were not from. And the singer was singing about how that tribe or community should be killed and finished. And I want to show you how we used what we call as Socratic methods of dialogue and discussion with adolescents to introduce ideas of nonviolence and of peace building. Socratic methods typically refer to methods of inquiry, ways of questioning, which are more reflective in nature. They are not interrogative. Their objective is to get children and adolescents to think, to respond, and to construct an idea or an ideology by responding to a series of questions that we keep putting in a gentle, non-judgmental manner to enable children to take perspective. That is really the idea. Let's look at how, so it becomes a little more clear. So here's the first part. These are excerpts of the conversation we had, right? The first part looked at acknowledgement of emotions, essentially to normalize, even legitimize feelings of anger and revenge. Dr. Shekhar and I will take you through this together, just for fun and to make it more interesting.
Here is some music we listen to.
Oh, is it some Manipuri music?
This is song on the violence. We must kill them and finish them.
Oh, what do you think about this song? Do you agree with the view of the singer?
What else is there to do given that what they have done to us? We are angry and we must take revenge. They started it and we must end it. Revenge is the only way now.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look at it. And your anger is very legitimate. When people burn our homes and hurt our people and families, we, of course, do not like it. And, it certainly makes us angry.
Maybe then the fight will then just keep going on. We have no choice but to kill.
Stress and sadness can manifest in different ways in different people. People have different ways of showing how upset and sad they are. Some people are sad and scared. Others may be angry and vengeful. But I think there might be more than one way to respond, And your need to express your feelings of anger and revenge through violence raises some important questions for how we could respond in such difficult situations. Yeah, this is one excerpt. Then here are some examples of questions that we put to adolescents to enable some perspective taking on the violence. So one way is to be violent, pick up the gun and kill. But we might also want to consider what impact this would have. Who would win? Would any side win at all? Would the crisis, if both sides continue the violence, ever come to an end? There's someone called Desmond Tutu in this country called South Africa. You know what he said? He said that when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt. So you think if we fight and continue in this way, you think things will ever end? So, we had responses to some of these questions and discussed them. But you see, we're not saying do or don't do. There's no advice. This is not a didactic method. These are just questions for reflection, as I said. Let's look at another excerpt on the other side and how different are they, getting adolescents to consider the other community and children and adolescents from the other side. So here are some questions we put. What do you think young people or teenagers on the other side are like? What do you think they were doing before the crisis? What were their interests?
Going to school, studying, listening to music, playing football, same as us.
So seems a lot like you. And like you, I guess they were not responsible for making these decisions that led people to getting hurt, to causing this situation. And it seems like you, they're suffering too, and they also seem to have lost their homes. What do you think, etc.? Yeah, so that's how the conversation went. And look at this last excerpt on decision making and future orientation.
What if we have to take a certain decision at a given point of time because the time is right for that?
Interesting question. Let me ask you a question so we think about this very important question you've put. What do you wish to be in the future when all of this is over, or if it didn't happen? What are your plans?
I want to become a footballer.
Okay, that's wonderful. So if you were to pick up the gun, would it lead you to your life's purpose and what you want to do? So, usually the child would respond. How do we decide what is more important. We may sometimes feel that something is more important because we have strong feelings about it. But in the long term, what happens? How do we see these things turning out? Right? The impact and consequences of our decisions may not always be time bound as we would like or imagine. They may extend beyond what we thought or intended. Like if we were to pick up a gun, believing it was the right uh, time to do it, at least for a while, the impact may extend way into our future, into years to come. The thing about any decision is that if we have to make it strongly, then we have to look at it from all sides and think about it. Let me give you an example. Think about when you buy a mobile phone. What are some of the things you would consider before you buy a phone?
Camera quality, sound quality, the model, the color, perhaps.
So this is exactly how we must also look at anything in life. Just like we don't buy the first mobile phone we see because we want a phone, we cannot really make a decision about our lives without considering all aspects of the decision. So what we do in our future means knowing when to pick up a gun, when not to pick it up, what the consequences would be if we pick it up, if we don't pick it up, right? So that's how we engage with adolescents in conversations such as these to look at shifting perspectives. Now, these were very brief conversations, but even in a span of, half an hour to 45 minutes, while there were some adolescents who said, well, I still think I'm going to join one of the armed groups and I want to fight, there were others who said, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe it's not the way. There were yet others who said, I need to think about this. But, friends, the point is precisely that. The idea is to engage in discussions such as this, to provide alternative ways of thinking, to get children to consider alternative perspectives that they otherwise would not have unless we introduce them. And the way we see it, techniques like these, like the use of the Socratic technique, are helpful to create what we call as, let's say, cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is very simply put, I think it would mean a sort of confusion in the mind. I knew very clearly and strongly what I wanted or what I wanted to do, but suddenly now I have a bunch of new thoughts. Is that what I really wanted to do? Should I be thinking about this differently? Are there different ways? Is she right? Maybe I need to reconsider this. For any shift in perspective and consequently in behavior decision making and then behavior change, some sort of dissonance needs to be introduced in a manner that is constructive, of course, in a manner that is gentle and non-judgmental. It is basically to offer alternatives. So these are some of the techniques we used. Moving on, we did have some discussions with mothers groups. As you can imagine, they had several concerns around PTSD, but particularly around even older children wanting to join armed factions, children saying they didn't want to go to school, that they'd rather go to training camps instead, so on. And some of the inputs and scripts that we gave to parents were around, first, of course, understanding why children were behaving differently, how to interpret some of their restlessness and anxiety related behaviors. We also talked to them about spending quality time in this crazy space that the relief camp was, where children and families felt so isolated. How do you anchor families and relationships? So we had suggestions like not just to play games, but to talk about stuff that the family had never talked about, like fun stuff. A fun fact about mom that you never knew. Here it is, stuff like that, or childhood stories that the parents may have to share. Because just like COVID, which offered opportunities for families to spend time that they wouldn't otherwise have had, to try and use this in a different or a more positive way to the extent possible, to engage adolescents in discussions on the pros and cons of participating in the violence, something similar to what I just explained now, to request parents to avoid any kind of discussion on the conflict in the presence of children, because parents and adults are so overwhelmed themselves, they forget that children are constantly listening and picking up ideas, imbibing viewpoints, and then projecting them as their own and acting upon them, isn't it? So when an adult is angry, talks about the other community and so on, that's what children take with them. We also provided them with some scripts to help children who had questions and anxieties about returning home. A constant refrain was, when can we go back home? How long do we have to stay here? So how do you explain time frames? What do you say to children in these very unpredictable and uncertain circumstances? So that was some of the work we did with parents. This is a snapshot of the training that we did. As you can see, the training was heavily trauma focused. We looked at communicating with children, providing first level responses to children using activity-based methods, heavy emphasis on loss and grief for obvious reasons. We also looked at some specialized interventions that stakeholders and service providers could implement with preschoolers and very young children, the most forgotten in situations such as this, because their development has the greatest risks in terms of disruptions and delays when situations like this occur. Moving on to reflections on ways forward. Friends, there are many, many ways to approach psychosocial and mental health interventions in humanitarian contexts. And we've just summarized for you from the literature and our experiences some of the others. So ranging from psychological first aid to narrative therapies to focused group-based work with children who have particular mental health disorders, family level and parenting related training to help families and parents cope and manage children's issues, to particular specialized programs for adolescents and school-based programs. There are all these different things, right? But in a nutshell, if you look at the large part of the literature and what is done in conflict-affected situations, essentially there is the objective of restoring normalcy through routine, predictability, engagement of children, restoring social and family connections to some extent. And then there is, of course, the heavily psychiatric approach requiring screening, identification, treatment of those who have mental disorders. The question I put to you for your consideration is this adequate? And, are these really addressing the problem? My point is not that these packages, these programs are not legitimate or that they don't work. They most certainly do. But are they more a sort of stopgap, band-aid approach to, just getting the PTSD symptoms to stop? Getting children to just get by and feel a little better? Or are there other things that we can do and alternative ways to consider these circumstances and children's experiences in these situations? So here are some new imperatives or other imperatives that may be considered based on what we've learned. What we learned was, of course, themes of loss and grief predominated children's emotional expressions. And we learned that these expressions and manifestations of loss and grief vary according to age. You have the very young children who draw pictures of homes, etc., express possible feelings of loss through art, or just draw them and, that's what the picture tells you. You have the middle childhood group, as I said, who were far more concrete in their expressions of loss because they're able to describe their homes, their surroundings, their daily routine, school, play, what they had, what they don't have, and so on. And then you have the adolescents, as you saw, as we illustrated to you briefly, with a greater awareness, and I don't say understanding, but certainly an awareness of communal disharmony, of the ethnic clashes, and the reasons for their current situation, and how loss and grief manifests in them as anger and revenge. So there are opportunities for peace building, particularly in the middle childhood group, but also in adolescents who are perhaps, the most vulnerable group in some ways in situations such as these because of their desire to take up arms and the consequent danger of perpetrating never-ending cycles of violence, therefore, for contexts like Manipur. So what must we really consider? Here are some things that we should. The first is conflict related bereavement and family systems. Now, family systems are the most natural, the most accessible, immediate social network for a bereaved child to communicate grief. But the issue is, do families really, who comprise of mourning adults who are very overwhelmed themselves, do they really have the space? Do they have the ability to help children process grief? The other issue is families themselves, like communities, the units of the community, they serve as repositories for memories of violence long after, right? So they play a huge part in creating this historical memory that everyone, children and adolescents included, dip into generation after generation. And that is why there is this whole issue of intergenerational trauma. It comes also not just from firsthand experience, but from these repositories of memories of violence, right? So that is one aspect to consider. A related aspect is the concept of disenfranchised grief, an exceedingly interesting and poignant concept, friends. What this means is that disenfranchised grief refers to survivors who do not have the right or are not accorded the right to grieve, wherein grief cannot be openly acknowledged. They don't have the right to publicly mourn or engage in grief related rituals, or their grief is not socially validated or supported. Now, another context for disenfranchised grief, for example, is suicide. When a family member commits suicide, the shame, the stigma that follows makes it very difficult for the other family members to legitimately grieve the loss of this person who's passed on. You look at contexts like HIV. When somebody dies of HIV and people cannot publicly grieve or grieve in socially legitimate ways because of the fear that, of stigma and what people will say. I don't have the right to say anything, I cannot grieve. Similarly, in humanitarian contexts, when people have been displaced, there is also the issue of ambiguous loss. I don't know where my father is. I hope he's alive. I don't even know whether he's alive. We've heard nothing from him for 2 months, right? How do we grieve in situations like this? So to not be able to grieve, to not have the freedom to grieve is a huge issue, and children bear a double burden in situations like this. One, as I said, because of the conflict, and two, because, as I mentioned earlier, family members are overwhelmed by their own grief, and children find very little space to express themselves or their experiences and their grief, because there's very little support for that. They're usually told, you know how it is, go and play, do something, right? No one has time for children in these situations. The third aspect to consider is the linkages between grief and anger, which the adolescents illustrate only too well. That grief can manifest in so many maladaptive ways, from chronic sadness to crippling illness to aggression, violence, feelings of revenge that essentially come from powerlessness, from guilt. There were so many stories, and I'm sure our Manipuri friends have many like this. My father went out that evening to buy food because there was none at home. and he never came back. I wish I hadn't let him go. I wish I had gone instead. It's my fault. So you see the guilt, the powerlessness that then leads to anger, then follows hatred, vengefulness, and revenge, which are then not far behind. And the fourth aspect to consider, therefore, and what really lies at the core of loss and grief experiences in situations such as Manipur is injustice. So little said, friends, about injustice. What is the nature of loss and grief in such situations after all? You know, you look at experiences of discrimination, abuse, exploitation, which translate into the loss of dignity, the loss of the right to equality, the loss of safety and protection, right? So that's what loss really means here. Loss is just not about losing people or separation from loved ones. That's one part of loss. But these are also experiences that we must view through the lens of loss and grief. And so that's what we are grieving. You know, what I had and don't have anymore, what I'm actually entitled to as a human being, as a child. So we are looking at gross violation of child rights, you know, a loss of rights. And as part of that, also the exclusion of children and adolescents in processes of healing and of conflict resolution. So what then, if these are the issues to consider, what then does it mean for reimagining mental health interventions for children in armed conflict? Here is a proposed model, and I'm going to leave you with that. If you look at the two parts of this model, you look at level 1 of interventions that we propose, it is to deal with the trauma of loss and grief, and particularly in disenfranchised grief. If we do not deal with loss and grief, we have no way forward, friends, because as you see, that really is the gateway to all other issues that follow, whether they are behavioral, psychological, etc. So what this means is allowing for sharing of trauma and loss and grief narratives. That is what we also briefly illustrated, allowing children to speak, to give voice to their experiences, helping them cope with these difficult feelings, which could, of course, include strategies to cope, acknowledging harm and emotions of anger, revenge, and powerlessness. Judith Herman, a Harvard-based psychiatrist, wrote a fascinating book titled Truth and Recovery. That's her latest work. And it's about women and violence. It's very interesting that she says, you know, she's interviewed many women who have been victims of violence and abuse since childhood. And she says what women want is not, or what victims of violence want is not punishment and retribution necessarily for the perpetrator. What they want is to be heard. What they want is for communities to acknowledge the wrong that has been done to them, to acknowledge the harm that has been done to them, instead of ignoring them, isolating them, and stigmatizing them, which is what frequently happens to victims of violence in any given context, right? So that's what we are saying here. When we talk about dealing with loss and trauma, it is to allow children to share their experiences, to share their truths. And that's how we link to level 2 of the interventions on reconciliation, justice, and peace building. If we want to move forward, friends, we have to deal with the past. We have to help children, communities deal with what has happened. It is not about forgetting. It is about telling the truth about what happened. It's about creating opportunities for voice. And when children have been through exploitation, injury, violence, witnessing and experiencing all these atrocities firsthand, do they not have the right to give voice, and must we not hear them, right? And from there on, we can offer cognitive perspectives on violence, on discrimination, Those are the alternatives that we also highlighted briefly in our adolescent example. To also consider, like in the Manipur context, an appreciation of diversity, right? To prevent engagement, therefore, in conflict and violence. And that is how we move to enabling children to participate in the rebuilding of the social fabric to ensure peaceful coexistence moving forward between the two ethnic communities. And these kind of interventions are premised on the principles of child rights, essentially children's right to participation, which is very closely tied to children's best interests. So children's best interests, safety, protection, basic needs, etc., can hardly exist without their participation. And if we were to move ahead in these exercises with only adults, I mean, if we were to move ahead in exercises or processes of reconciliation and we exclude children, then we are missing a huge opportunity for providing more sustainable and long-term solutions to a peaceful coexistence in contexts like Manipur. The other critical premise, and I will conclude with this, is that of justice-informed mental health care. As I think Judith Herman's book, and I hope many of you will have a chance to read it, quite clearly states that there is no mental health without integrating the precepts of justice, particularly in contexts of violence, any context of violence, whether it's an individual child with sexual abuse or whether we are speaking of communities such as Manipur has currently a justice-informed mental health approach where we integrate participation, justice, address issues of injustice is really the only way forward for mental health interventions if we must be effective. Thank you very much for your attention. I believe we will open the floor.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for that. Principles of child rights and justice-informed mental health care. You can use either the chat option, friends, and I see that some comments have already come on chat. I'm not sure whether there's a hands raised option here. There is. You could use the hand raised option also to share your thoughts and perspectives, or perhaps put a question either to Sheila
Right.
or to me.
I see.
But let's go through some of the comments that are already there on chat.
Right. So Vijay Rajkumar sir says, is there a role of compassion and forgiveness, both for the other and the self in the process of reconciliation? Yes, sir. In fact, these cognitive perspectives that I referred to on violence and discrimination heavily entail looking at issues of compassion and humanity. Forgiveness is an interesting concept and a very tricky one. It may not have the same role to play as compassion. We cannot force or necessarily bring about forgiveness. I would go more with acknowledgement of harm as a first step to rebuilding rather than looking at forgiveness. And perhaps, I mean, there are contexts such as Manipur where there's been mass atrocities and a lot of people have been involved, and then there are individual contexts. Just a quick word on forgiveness in a child sexual abuse context. Many people have said, can a child be asked to forgive his or her perpetrator? Between forgiving the perpetrator on the one hand and carrying the anger and hatred lifelong as a burden on the other, in those kind of situations, we often advocate for a third way, that is to disengage and to sort of make the perpetrator a persona non grata. You know, you don't have to either forgive or be angry all the time. You can decide that this person is not important and that you wish to move forward with in your life. But where situations like Manipur are concerned, humanitarian contexts are far more complex. I believe there are elements of forgiveness that come in, but again, we cannot compel it. We are probably better looking at the road to compassion. Let's look at Venkat Reddy sir's question. Peer groups' influence on adolescents outside the family situations which shape their value system on many issues. Very true, sir. Any thoughts on this to work with adolescent groups outside family situations and what skills? Again, it is all these concepts that require to be introduced, whether it is volunteers or mental health interventions or life skills programs in schools. They must act very often as counter socialization processes to what is occurring within the family. It is a tall task, it is challenging, but I think it is groups outside that need to also look at how to influence adolescent thinking by introducing, depending on what the context is and what themes are relevant in a context such as this. We are talking about themes of violence, discrimination, taking perspective on peace building, decision making, and consequences to help adolescents to reconsider possibly some of the ideas that are often reiterated within their families, which are more likely to, though not always, center around anger, hatred, revenge, and so on. Right. I see Toibi ma'am points out several issues to consider. Yes, helping children out necessitates that parents, caretakers, adults be heard too. Very true, ma'am. And that goes back to what we were saying about bereavement in families. The interesting thing about bereavement is when one person died, it's not just one child or one person who's affected. It is at least 6, 7, 8, 20 people around. So yes, a lot of work needs to be done with adults as well. Health providers are in mourning. Yes, this is a characteristic of humanitarian situations.
Yeah.
The stakeholders and service providers themselves are deeply affected. And how do we, help them with debriefing sessions? How do we support them so that they're able to convert their own experiences into sensitivities and strengths rather than being overwhelmed or frozen, as the case may be? Yes, there is, as you point out, an adultification of children in contexts like this, precisely the issue of, children saying, I don't want to go to school, I want to take up arms. And that's where these kind of interventions become critical. I see that Lintoy ma'am says, was there any element of vicarious trauma which came through the interaction, considering access to social medias and passive information that they seem to imbibe from the environment? There were certainly elements of these. You look at even the beginning of the adolescent conversation. Now, certainly when there are singers belting out music that is almost preaching violence, and the adolescents also said that they were watching a lot of this violence that was being put on social media, which is why the government, as you recall, in fact, cut off access to internet to probably stop precisely this kind of problem. So yes, certainly there were traumas and experiences that came through other people, through narratives, through the social media. How can schools or temporary learning centers be integrated into mental health support for displaced children? Interesting, Princey ma'am, that you asked that question. We are working out with the Department of Social Welfare in Manipur currently to go back in a month's time, and we are actually going to pilot this model that we placed for your consideration. We are going to work in a couple of schools and in a couple of childcare institutions to look at implementing activities and interventions of this nature. So I think we'll be able to say more about what we did and how things worked when we finish. We are actually going to do a 2-phase intervention. And we are very grateful, as always, to the Social Welfare Department, who does not discriminate between communities or ethnicities in how they are so committed to protecting children across the state. Have you ever experienced when a child has asked you what he or she has done to deserve to be there? Yes, not necessarily in the Manipur context, but I've heard that frequently in many other humanitarian contexts that I've worked in with children and psychosocial interventions. Our response to this is, it ranges from it was not your fault in case there is guilt. And of course, you did nothing to deserve it. We talk about coincidences, wrong place, wrong time, having just been there. It could have been anybody. It just happened to be you, or it just happened to be your dad or your mom who was standing in that place where the bomb fell, where the shooting occurred. Similarly, if you look at the Pahalgam issue now in Kashmir, a lot of it was that, right? Who knew? So it was just a bunch of tourists, and it was just chance that it was those 25 people who went there on a given day. It could have been anybody. So we use responses of that nature when children ask questions like that. Marine ma'am says, in the present times, we often see a lot of diagnostic labels put on children, especially when we have externalizing behaviors. Very true. How do we as mental health professionals develop a better perspective that is not so reductionist? I think you make such a critical point, ma'am. I'm reminded of many children we see in the context of violence and abuse and so on. And that's why understanding any kind of behavior is entirely actually dependent on the context. Without a context, it is almost impossible to interpret behavior correctly and attribute behaviors to clinical symptoms and diagnostic labels. Otherwise, we are not only reductionist, we do great injustice to children. So thanks for that first set of questions. I see Princey ma'am has another question. How can mental health services for displaced adolescents be made more gender sensitive, especially for girls who may face additional vulnerabilities? I think it's a matter of asking about experiences and placing the gender discussion before them. Would this be different for boys? Would it be, is it just girls? But I think it would also be problematic if we skewed the discussion in ways that gave children the impression that either girls or boys are more or less vulnerable. The truth, friends, is that boys and girls are both vulnerable, just in differently in different contexts. If you look at child labor, very often boys are more vulnerable because they are picked by families and sent off to work in faraway places and so on. If you look at sexual abuse, girls are probably more vulnerable. So I think, again, context matters. So it's important that children understand that we are talking more about human beings, about people and vulnerabilities. And gender is one dimension. So it may be more useful to help them see it that way. Shikha, I don't know whether you'd like to add some perspectives at this point in time.
I'm trying to actually formulate in my mind an integrated framework of all that has been shared and asked in chat. I'd like to allude to some broad approaches and ways of thinking, and to some very specific actions on the field. I go back to actually to Reverend Desmond Tutu in post-apartheid South Africa, when he set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, very strongly embedded in the principles of reconciliation psychology. In mainstream mental health, reconciliation psychology and peace building is not taught. even through the pandemic, we really learned about the importance of the whole construct of social cohesion and the social role and obligation that mental health professionals have really in peace building and in principles of social cohesion. In fact, through many displacement experiences that Sheila and I have worked independently and often together, the Gujarat earthquake, the other issue that took place in Gujarat, where people were displaced and so on, and the presence of mental health professionals there r- roughly rides through 5 levels of intervention. Depth therapy for a PTSD and severe manifestations of trauma. Counseling interventions for those who are in consternation, a little anxious, a little afraid. Meeting the developmental needs of children who are dislocated and displaced. Being in the camps essentially to structure their day. And finally, your presence there as an expression of solidarity. So, solidarity and social cohesion, coming from the principles of reconciliation psychology on one hand, and restorative practices on the other, are increasingly beginning to inform the kind of work that we can do in communities where community based interventions from these principles, as well as those of community psychology, actually come in. That's one issue. The second really looks at individual work that we do in camps using group methodologies, or within the camp itself with an individual child who has more serious affectations, where the kind of levels that Sheila has spoken about in the model that we have proposed, which we intend to uh, actually implement in a month or so. Our approach to go back to the issue that Princey actually raised, to bring that to scale as we hope in the work that we do a month from now, would also involve other service providers so that they will be part of the work that we do, and then they will be able to carry that out in other concentric circles in other schools which are hitherto not served in what we wish to implement. So this is roughly what we have thought of. We also hope to work with the mental health system in the state.
I wanted to add a couple of things, if I may. One, I'll answer this question quickly, that Vijaya has put, that sometimes there's a risk of pathologizing normal distress. Absolutely true, which is why I presented to you a whole range of mental health interventions that are largely looking at clinical issues, and hence the model to shift away from pathologizing what is actually a normal and legitimate response to something that is hugely abnormal in conflict situations like this. Before I come to Shruti ma'am's question, I want to go back. I had a thought about the question that Vijay sir raised on forgiveness. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the South African history and the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission by Desmond Tutu. One of the things that the commission did, in addition to having victims come forward to tell their story, and that's the bit about acknowledging harm, giving them the right to be heard, allowing them to have a voice, is also for perpetrators to come forward to hear some of these accounts and to acknowledge that, to describe and acknowledge that they did these terrible things to people. And the commission then reserved the right to make a decision to grant amnesty, as they called it, which is very close to forgiveness. That is to allow these perpetrators to go free, so to speak. Not exactly that, but so that they wouldn't be criminalized and put in prison. Now, this approach that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission took has been much criticized. They said, people said, oh, so you're just letting them off the hook, and just because they admit that they have committed these terrible wrongs, you're saying that's enough. And they go scot-free. But Desmond Tutu himself said it wasn't as simple as that. And we really need to look at the larger picture here. And that's why, friends, I also made the distinction between an individual child that we are assisting in a context of family violence or sexual abuse versus a context like this of humanitarian emergency and mass violence. The difference is enormous because when so many people in the community are involved, uh, it is hard. I mean, there are countries that have also taken the judicial and criminalizing approach. But the question that I believe South Africa put was how many people, can we criminalize and put behind bars? There'll be no end to this. And what is the way forward for a country, a state, or communities, right? So, amnesty, they believed, was actually a very carefully thought out thing, albeit with limitations, to say the only way forward and for us to be able to coexist in peace would be to consider some element of forgiveness. So, sir, you are not wrong. It is about how we introduce it. We cannot compel it, but the idea must be there for communities and masses of people to move forward, without which we can't. And Manipur will struggle to do so, just like others, right? Shruti ma'am says, when children imbibe racist, nationalist, extremist ideas from their parents, families early in childhood, how can MHPs moderate their thinking and behaviors in face of armed conflict? Again, it is to do work on issues relating to diversity. So how do we, at a very, very simple level, we are actually talking about exercises, activities that we do with children in the context of bullying. What is bullying after all? It is a child being bullied means a child is being discriminated against, excluded, made fun of on the basis of caste, color, height, IQ, and various other, it's the same thing at a much simpler level, what goes on in schools. So to integrate this into schools, and someone had a question about schools, is really to look at issues of bullying and diversity. How do we help children understand diversity? How do we work with them to say different is okay? Different is wonderful. How do we introduce these ideas to say everyone doesn't have to be the same? And how do we inculcate ideas of tolerance and diversity from early childhood? It is through these kind of simple exercises and stories. We are happy to, of course, share with you Samvad's life skill modules, which have quite a bit on bullying and discrimination. And you're free to use exercises like that and then adapt it to specific contexts and children's issues depending on the child you're seeing.
We are, in terms of how children imbibe different ideologies, contending with a lot of issues, whether it's radicalism, uh, extremism, or whether it is manosphere, as those of you who've watched the Netflix series Adolescents, on which we did a program and also wrote a piece in the Asian Journal of Psychiatry. But do have a look on chat. We've put our links for the life skills work that we do. We are nearing the end of the time that we kept for this webinar. Once again, friends, to remind you that the International Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health and Allied Professionals recognizes in April the World Infant, Child and Adolescent Mental Health Day, and the Indian Association has hosted this program for your benefit. And I see that a lot of acknowledgement is coming, people thanking us for this session and perhaps for the perspectives that it has provided. The association will continue to come with informative seminars and webinars on this issue. We've also put a couple of other links on our other material. Please have a look at it, which is put on chat. And I take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Sheila Ramaswamy, for sharing your work in Manipur and the work of SAMVAD. And with that, I think if you have any last words to say, and then we will close the session.
No, just that we would really welcome any interest, engagement from the mental health and child protection fraternity, for these are important initiatives to experiment with, to undertake, really important ones for children. So we hope that we'll have more people join us as we work. And thank you all once again for coming on and for your very interesting contributions, your very interesting and important reflections on the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, friends, and a very good night from SAMVAD and a very good night from ICAM.